Hi, my name is John, and today I'll be going through the verbal reasoning types of questions in the thinking skills section in both the opportunity class and the selective exam here in New South Wales. Let's get into it. The new thinking skills section in both the opportunity class and selective New South Wales exams is always going to be quite tricky and complex, considering that it's a completely new section compared to what is being assessed in previous years. Because it's so new, that means there's a lot less preparation and content that we have in order for us to really prepare for questions of this type. And students are not able to use what they've learned in previously, maybe in general ability, to apply and answer questions in this type of exam. Like with all things, if you have enough time to practice it and there's enough materials and you know the right approach, you will get better marks and it will get easier to actually answer these types of questions. But since we don't really have that, and since it's still relatively new, there is a lot of misinformation and a lot of confusion that is surrounding this particular portion of the exam as well. One of the types of question that you may actually see in the thinking skills section is verbal reasoning questions. And this is a combination of reading comprehension and critical thinking, which you'll see in both these exams. I'll be going through the general approach that you should take when answering these types of questions, as well as some tips that you need to keep in mind, as well as at the very end include an example of how we might apply what I've been talking about to try to answer these questions, even if they are of increasing difficulty. First, verbal reasoning questions are designed in a way that you have to have a sufficient level of reading comprehension to really understand and answer what's going on. Added to this fact as well, you also need a certain level of prose, as they typically try to go over content that are being assessed that are well beyond what they are typically used to in that grade. So that means when you're doing the test in year 4 or when you're doing the test in year 6, sometimes the words and the way that they use the sentence structure may be a little bit unfamiliar, and that adds extra difficulty. It requires active engagement with the text, understanding what it's trying to asking, utilizing different reading comprehension techniques to try to decipher that information, develop and create your own hypotheses, as well as test whether that is correct. You have to also determine whether the relationship of what is being asked, as well as what is actually being presented, as sometimes what is being asked may be quite similar to what is being talked about, but if it's just similar and not actually answering the question, it can be part of that trick. So you don't want to fall into that trap. Instead, you want to actually decipher exactly what is being asked and then answer it accordingly. Each verbal reasoning question is typically a passage, and they do vary in length, but they typically go for just about a paragraph, or at most a paragraph or 2. Additionally as well, it can be drawn from a variety of different text types, so it's quite hard to predict what they can actually give you. Some can be humanities, it could be based on fiction, it could be based on anything that you can really think about, an information report, and the list goes on. The questions can cover any of the topics that I just mentioned, but you can also integrate academic or even non-academic sources when they're extrapolating where they decide where this passage comes from in the first place. In terms of the question as well, typically there's 4 choices and there's only one correct answer that you have to choose throughout. They might ask you the definition of a certain word, if a word is related or unrelated, or what we see in the sample papers, as well as what you'll see in the OC and the selective exam as well, is whether it strengthens or weakens the argument that is being talked about in that paragraph. Some of the abilities that are being tested in these types of questions is the understanding of the meaning of words, sentences, and paragraphs. Secondly, it's the ability to also distinguish between major and minor points, drawing conclusions from information provided, summarizing passages, as well as drawing reasoning from a variety of different information to try and infer meaning that might be missing. And lastly, identifying the author's assumptions and objective. especially when we have to try to infer the meaning of why it was written like this in the first place. This is by no means the most comprehensive list, but it should assess some of the key things that are typically going to be tested in this types of question. So just keep that in mind, that there are more things that will typically be required when answering these questions as well. So now that we know what these questions are actually trying to test, I'll then go into the typical approach and tips that you should be aware of. In terms of advice, the first thing I want you to be aware of is that because they are verbal reasoning questions, they can use words that you might be really unfamiliar with. Typically, the words that they use can sound quite complex, but something to keep in mind of, especially because where they're pulling the passages might be from, it can be something that can be quite confronting at the very beginning. Keep calm, because the types of these questions and the nature of the thinking skills exam means that you don't actually need external knowledge to answer the question. All the information that you need to answer the question is there. So if there is words or even sentences you don't understand, take a breather, try to infer the meaning from whether it be the sentences around it, and try to guess what that word might mean in order for you to best answer that question. Just because if the text is talking about Shakespeare, if you don't know anything about Shakespeare, that's totally fine. You can still answer it based on the information that's provided. You don't have to use your previous knowledge of Hamlet or Romeo and Juliet to actually answer that question. The second advice that I like to share is you want to distinguish clearly between the main idea and the supporting idea. So what the writer will be doing is they might be expanding on a point because that's the main idea. They might build on it, provide an example, explain it, and that's about it. While they might also include some supporting information, but they won't expand on that. So try to determine what information are they building upon, what is the main thing that they're trying to focus on, as opposed to what's a nice to have information. What is an information where they just added in to maybe provide a little bit more context, a little bit more information, but it's definitely a bit more of a supporting part. And the third and final advice that I would want you to keep in mind of is, are the points they're talking about consistent, or do they contrast each other? So similarly to the second advice that I shared, you want to make sure that if they are talking about one point, maybe it's about Shakespeare and it's, one of the best written drama pieces of all time, then maybe they talk about another part which contradicts this, or does it just support that point? So if it says, hey, it's the best in the first half of the paragraph, in the second half, but critics say that it's actually a copy of many other pieces, and many other pieces are actually better than that. So you know that the 2 points are actually conflicting. So the question that's going to be asked is going to be something related to that, and you have to determine which one supports that question that is being asked. But if it's not conflicting and they're actually aligned, then that could also provide a little bit more context. So you want to make sure you understand the relationship between sentences in order for you to answer the question. Now that we know the general advice to follow, I'll now go into the 3-step approach. The first step in this approach is pay attention to the meanings in context. Basically what this means is different words have different meanings when they're utilized and applied in different ways. Same with the reading portion of the selective and OC exam, or any question in fact. Some words have different meanings. They could be a noun in one way, or it could be a verb in another. So you want to make sure that you identify and know how it's being used. So if you know how it's being used, then you can increase your chances of actually answering that question. Don't just use your own memory and think that, okay, well, that word only has that meaning, or that word has to be like this, because depending on how it's used, it could mean something completely different. So you don't want to misinterpret information just based on that judgment. The second step in the approach is make sure you read all the available answers for the multiple choice. So one of the key mistakes that I see students make typically is that they might see the first answer or see the second answer and say, it has to be that answer, before reading all the available choices. that actually shoots yourself in the foot, because what if it's the third option or the fourth option? You want to make sure you double check and read all the available choices and then check the text following that. Our memories are not foolproof. We're human, we make mistakes. Even me, I make heaps of mistakes. I would say my memory is not even that great. What you want to do is just always double check whatever's being assessed. If they say it's strengthening a certain argument, then just double check which one actually strengthens it. You don't want to choose one that weakens it, or says the exact same thing, which doesn't provide any reinforcement to it. The third and final approach that I would recommend is definitely don't be misled by certain answers. And what I mean by this is, out of the 4 choices that you have available, typically some will only be partially true, or it could be the opposite of what is being asked. You want to make sure that whatever is being assessed, the meaning and whatever the text aligns. That even if it's 50% correct, or you may be able to infer that response from the passage, you want to make sure it's quite explicit and it definitely correlates. So if they're talking about Shakespeare being one of the greatest written pieces of all time, and one of the responses is that it talks about Shakespeare's age, well, they're somewhat related because Shakespeare wrote that, but it's not really related to his actual work. So it could not be this response in this particular example. So they typically will use some of the buzzwords to try to trick you, but in saying that though, some of the correct answers also use some of the keywords as well. So try to identify and differentiate between answers that are only partially correct, absolutely misleading, or is actually correct. I've also included an example that I have put down on screen. If you actually utilize the advice that I recommended, as well as the 3-step approach, I believe that the likelihood of you actually answering this question will actually skyrocket. So in terms of this, we know that the answer is actually A, because there has been a steady decline in the yearly revenues generated in the energy tax in Freeland. Don't know how to pronounce it, but you don't actually need to know how to pronounce it because it's not a speaking test, it's a thinking skills test. So hopefully that actually answers that. Although the other options could be partially true or be inferred, answer number A is the most correct based on the information and passage that is being provided. In conclusion, I've gone through the verbal reasoning types of question in the thinking skills exam, both the opportunity class as well as the selective test here in New South Wales. It is tricky, especially because it was recently designed by Cambridge Assessments, and this type of question doesn't have much practice papers or solutions in regards to that. So I decided that it was important for me to try to break that down, go over some of the approaches that we typically go through in our classes to help potential students that are doing this type of exam. I went over the 3 advice and 3 tips that I would go over, as well as the 3-step approach that I'll also go over as well. I did go over a quick example, but it is quite tough to actually try to fit this in a 8 to 10 minute video. So please do mind if I didn't go into the amount of depth that you might actually require. If you still want some more further clarification, feel free to write it down in the comments below. Like this video, definitely subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you.